This is a production of Cornell University.
So this is the title today, Reputation Spillovers, and looking at consumer response to wine appellations and the information that's embedded in those wine appellations. And just as a way of background, this project is part of a large multi or even transdisciplinary grant from the USDA called the Specialty Crops Research Initiative, and I'm involved in a few of these with different people in horticulture and food science. This one is called Improved Grape and Wine Quality in a Challenging Environment, an Eastern U.S. Model for Sustainability and Economic Vitality. And the captain of the team is Tony Wolf. Some of you might know Tony. He was a student at Geneva. And there is quite a cast of characters from this department and from food science. Some famous horticultural scientists, including Ian, Justine, and Alan. And you can see down below, these are the five loosely related objectives that bring together objectives that are important to viticulturalists, in this case people in the horticulture department, food scientists, and then me as the social scientist. And my main objective in this grant is looking at this question of establishing a reputation for consistent, high-quality grape and wine production in the East. And these projects, I've been involved with a few of them, and you tend to have you'd write a proposal where you have these objectives that are loosely connected, and then you go off and do your disciplinary research, and towards the end of the project you start to sort of find ways to bring your results back to the same page and to tie and integrate these things back together. And I think we're making pretty good progress on that front with this grant. So, reputation. And the question here, one of the questions here is, how do you create a reputation for horticulture products, for horticulture firms? In this case, it's wine. And wine is kind of a nice case to think about because in the wine industry there's both firm reputations that can be influenced by the terroir, by the soil, the climate. It can also be influenced by what the wine experts are writing about, and there's some fairly influential wine expert rating agencies in the United States as well as other places. Other good press, past vintages all have an influence on firm reputation. And then economists also talk about collective reputation, which is the reputation for a group of firms in a similar geographic unit. It's not always geography that holds them together. Sometimes it's part of an industry, but in many cases a collective reputation is for a group of firms in a geographic unit. And in addition to those things that influence firm reputation, here we also see things like the name of the AVA or the press or the wine scores for that AVA. And if you're not familiar, AVA is the abbreviation for an American Viticultural Area, which is a geographic unit that's been identified by the TTB, which is a sub-part of the U.S. Bureau of Census. Many of you are more familiar with these than I am. But it's a good example of a well-defined geographic unit. And we think, or we propose, that this collective reputation for a group of wineries might also be influenced by that AVA making a link to another geographic unit somewhere else in the world that's more established, that has a better reputation, that's more famous. And we think that having this reputation linkage to another part of the world might be more important for an emerging wine region like New York. The captain of this project is from Virginia, and so Virginia is another burgeoning wine district in the United States. And there's a question, how do they develop a reputation? So this is this idea of reputation spillovers, tying the reputation of your emerging wine region or established to somewhere else in the world, and are there economic benefits to doing so? But like a lot of things, there's laws. There's laws about how far you're allowed to do this. In 2006, the United States signed an agreement. It was titled an agreement between the EC and the United States on trade in wine. And it was amended in 2010. Within this 300-page legal document, there was, I think, probably too many words. They could have condensed this. So for instance, Article 7, if you can bumble your way through the Article 7 states that certain names may be used as names of origin for wine only to designate wines of the origin indicated by such a name, those listed in Annex 4, Part A, names of quality. And it goes on kind of in this circular language, but there's very strict guidelines about what information you can put on a label. Okay? So there are, in fact, when you look at this Annex 4, there's hundreds of protected EU names that can't make their way anymore onto a front or a back label in the United States of a wine product. Okay? And some of these are kind of these reputation spillover words. You can't use those on the front or the back labels on wine in the United States. So for instance, I used to live in the Central Coast. This is one of my favorite wines back there. And you can see that in 2006, a winery outside of Santa Barbara you might not be able to see this, but they explicitly used the word Rhone on the front label. You can see that. And then the same wine in 2007, that was the last year before they were told by the TTB to stop using these protected names on their labels. You can see on their 07 label, they actually go a little bit farther and they use Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the Rhone Valley on their front label. Okay? And in their 08 label, which hasn't come out yet, won't have any of this type of words on the front label or the back label. Okay? So there are these regulations, but when we look out into the world, I still see a lot of non-label references to these reputation spillovers, if you will. Okay? So in the Anderson Valley, just a little bit west of Sonoma, there is a festival every year called the Alsace Varietals Festival. And so it's a festival of those varietals that come from this part of the world. The wines, though, are not from this part of the world. The wines come from Oregon, Washington. There's a few New York producers that go to this festival. There's a lot of California. So they're sort of borrowing the goodwill and the reputation from this area to advertise their wine festival. And further down in Southern California, there's something called the Hospice du Rhône, which is another wine event that again borrows this very famous name from France and uses it to celebrate, to promote the wines. You know, and this one's been happening for 20 years. This one is in its 7th year, annual festivals. So there are these examples of these reputation spillovers in the world, just they're not on labels of wine. Okay? And so we're curious, this is all in California, we're curious if this also can be used as a marketing tool in emerging wine regions. So, our research question. We want to see how consumers, real live consumers, respond to information about reputation spillovers, and to see if, when they're exposed to this kind of information, does it influence their demand for the wine or the price that they're willing to pay for the wine. And if I could just have an aside, this type of question is the type of question I usually try to have in these transdisciplinary big research. As an economist or someone interested in marketing when I'm working with horticulture people, this is kind of bringing the research back to what it means to real consumers and how do consumers respond to technology changes, or how do consumers respond to information or to higher quality products. Okay? And then, in addition to this question, or as a sub-question, we're interested to see if this response to wine information about these reputation spillovers, if it's the same for all types of people, for all types of wine, and if that information affects these people in the same way. Okay? We go into this thinking, perhaps, that this type of information, these reputation spillovers, might be more important in emerging wine regions, and we think that it might be more important for people who know something about wine, perhaps, but that's an empirical question. And the approach we use, and this is an approach I've used a few times in the last few years, over on the other side of the quad, in the basement, there is a lab for experimental economics and decision research, and perhaps some of you have participated in the basement. I'll show you a few pictures in a minute, and we invite consumers into this lab, pay them, and ask them to participate in some sort of a consumer study. In this case, we're going to ask them to submit bids for some wine products, and then different treatments have different information, and we try to tease out the influence of the information on their valuation of the wines. So it's a lab experiment, a consumer lab experiment. We brought in 264 people to this, and that's, if you can get, I think because wine was in the title of the flyer, I think that helped us in our recruitment efforts. But that's a pretty good draw. So 264, non-student, that's fairly important. So it's important in several ways, but so students, you know, there's some students in the room, no offense, but students don't always reveal their information. Sometimes they're in the lab perhaps to just get the prize money and go. Some of them haven't developed a full, a full appreciation for wine, so it's hard to really include them in the mix. And a lot of students are less than 21 years old, and it was a lot of work getting the permits from the, I'm not sure if you've ever dealt with or read about the State Liquor Authority, the SLA. I think that took a couple of years off the end of my life trying to deal with them and all their permits. And so anyways, we got a permit that would allow us to auction wines, but we didn't get a permit that allowed us to sample wines, which was nearly impossible because it was in the middle of a work day. We ran these from noon to 1, and it's probably not productive to send people back to the office after. And what we did is we brought them in and we asked them to place bids on 7 white wines, so 7 commercial white wines from 3 different U.S. regions. Okay, so we had 3 bottles of Chardonnay, 1 from California, 1 from Oregon, and 1 from Virginia. We had 2 bottles of Pinot Gris, 1 from California, 1 from Oregon, and then we had 2 bottles of Viognier, 1 from California and 1 from Virginia. 7 bottles. Is this where I tell you? They all have relatively, we really went out of our way to find 7 bottles of wine that had fairly simple labels. They didn't have cute animals or not a lot of colors. They really were mostly text. They were all from 2009, and every wine bottle received at least 1, in most cases 2 wine expert scores in the 80s. And we took all of our subjects through like the introduction to Robert Parker wine scores and told them sort of what a 70s meant and what a score in the 80s meant and a score in the 90s. So it was a bit of work, but we found these 7 bottles of wine that seemed to fit these categories so that we felt we were on a relatively even playing field going into this experiment. Okay, so they had the same information about quality, it was the same year, and the labels were as much as we could control, they were the same. There was some discussion whether we should put the bottles in brown bags so as to hide some of these nuances, but in the end we thought that might be a little weird to consumers coming into the lab, so we decided just to leave the bottles so that everyone could see them, full information, and everybody, all 264 people saw all of this information.
Brad, was this all at one time, and were these mainly Cornell employees?
I would say that about 60 to 70% were Cornell employees, not faculty. So I guess we've made fun of students. We can make fun of faculty too. They're weird subjects. So we don't allow Cornell faculty. Sometimes they sneak in, but we don't let them come in. We don't let students come in. So it was mostly staff. And then we also advertise on Craigslist. So we had a lot of people from Tompkins County, Cortland County come in. That's a little more work because we have to help them with parking. So it's not a preference, but it's something that we did. And just to be clear, we brought these people in over the course of 4 weeks. So we'd run these sessions Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for 4 weeks. Two of these weeks were, and it was all during the winter break when staff perhaps had a little more time to participate in this study. That's a good question. And then these subjects randomly signed themselves up to one of 3 treatments. There was 3 treatments. The first treatment, there was really what we'd call no information, nothing more than the information above my hand. So they knew where the wines were from, they knew the scores, they knew what the labels looked like, they knew they were from 2009, but they didn't get any additional information. Treatment 2 got some additional information about the American Viticultural Area and some technical information about that AVA. And then the third treatment got information about the same information about the AVA, and then we also linked that AVA to another region which was similar in some regard to that AVA, but that other region was in France. Okay, so in that third treatment, we were trying to make a link to a region that had a longer, a more established, a more famous wine region. Okay, so each of those 7 wines in the third treatment was linked to a specific wine-producing region in France. Okay, and that was the difference between these. And we replicated each treatment 4 times. Okay, that's our 3 treatments, 4 times. That gave us our 12 sessions, and we had about 22 people come. There's 24 chairs in the room, 24 computers, and we usually filled up about 22 of them each day, which is pretty good. But again, I think it's because it had wine in the title. Here's what the room looks like in the basement of Warren Hall. When Warren Hall gets done, I think it's going to look fancier. But this is, I think, for instance, these privacy shields, they're a little wonky now, I agree. But I think when this room gets built, they'll be a much more fancier enclosed unit. Some of these experiments use sound, so there's headset there. We didn't use sound. I was just up front explaining this, and you can see up front the different wines on display, and we asked everyone to look at them, and people picked them up and read them as they came into the room and were randomly seated at these different stations. And here's a close-up of what it looked like up front, where you had the 7 wines. Every day we randomized the order in which we held the auctions. And then every week we had a different practice item. So before these people sit down at a computer and start submitting bids for the wines, and it's a little bit complicated. They have to submit their wine bid on the computer in front of them. And it's like a program like many other things where it might not be fully intuitive the first time. So we asked them to go through a practice auction so they see how it works. And we always had a practice item every day that we ran them through. I don't have time to talk about this today, but there's like a little sub-experiment going on here. I have a long interest in the impact, the economic impact of selling wine in grocery stores. And so my sub-experiment is each week I had a different practice item. So this particular week I was selling bread and cheese. So that was sort of sending out this message that perhaps wine and bread and cheese were sold in my little store in Warren Hall. And then another week I'd have the wine, and then I had a bottle of vodka. And that would be the practice item. And then another week I'd just have a control item. I think it was just a game or something. And surprising that what you put here has a small influence on the bids. And more importantly, what you put here has different bids, different influence on the different wines. And so those wines from Virginia would be the emerging region. The wines from California would be the established region. And people, this is a talk for another day, but when you have bread and cheese here, that had a positive influence on the wines from the lesser known regions. So if you were a winery from Virginia and you were selling that wine with bread and cheese, it had a positive impact. It didn't really have any impact on the California wines. When you had vodka up front, up top, that had a slight negative premium, like a slight negative effect on the values for the Virginia wines. So I'm not sure exactly what to make of that, but that's a another question. So everybody saw this map. And this would be the map that treatment 1, 2, and 3 would see. Treatment 1, this is all they would see. And so I would just tell them there was 2 wines from Oregon, there was 3 wines from California, there's 2 wines from Virginia. And then we'd move into the auctions. If you were part of treatment 2, you'd see this map, and then I'd give you more information, perhaps too much information, but I'd give you more information about the specific appellations. So I would talk about the Santa Ynez AVA, because one of our wines came from that. I'd talk about the Santa Lucia Highlands, which is another AVA, or I'd talk about the Russian River Valley, because one of our wines came from that very specific AVA. I do the same for Oregon. I talk about the 2 AVAs. And I do the same for Virginia. I talk about the very specific AVAs. And these are all 3 of these are maps that I borrowed from the wine institutes in those different states. So they're all AVA maps. And if you were in treatment 3, only in treatment 3, you'd also get information about France. Okay? And specifically, we would say that the 3 varietals, the Chardonnay, the Viognier, and the Pinot Gris, have this historical roots in France. And we talk about Alsace as being the historical place where Pinot Gris was first grown and marketed. And we talk about the two subregions within Alsace. And that would allow us to link the two Pinot Gris, the Oregon Pinot Gris to the top part of Alsace, and the California Pinot Gris to the Haut-Rhin, to the lower part of this appellation. And we'd make this linkage. Same with the Chardonnays. We'd make linkages to three parts of Burgundy and talk about how there's linkages. And the two Viogniers, we'd made references to the upper and the lower Rhone Valley to try to enforce that there was this linkage between those, and if there was any reputation spillover that we could make. Does that all make sense? It's a good place. Just I like to see a nod, gentle nod. Okay. Okay. Good. So if you were in treatment 1, you would see 7 bottles of wine. I would be standing up front much like this, and you would have a computer that would have the same information on your screen that I'm showing. And this is what you'd see in treatment 1. You'd see the bottle. We'd talk about the state and the varietal, and that would be it. And we'd ask you to submit a bid that represents the most that you'd be willing to pay for this bottle of wine. And if you're in treatment 2, a very similar looking sheet, but now you'd be given information about the AVA. And this is a summary of the information that I give about the AVA. And I had a script that I stuck to very carefully. But I didn't overdo it. But it was a short script on that AVA. And then I'd show this map, and I'd show on this map where that AVA is. And again, sticking to the script. And if you're in treatment 3, again, you'd see this information, and now we would make this link to the lower Rhone Valley in France. The same sort of technical information lead them to believe that these were similar production regions or had similar characteristics. I think in this case, the script said something about, here's Santa Ynez, down near Santa Barbara, made the link to the lower Rhone Valley. We made some reference to the weather in these two places, the limited rainfall in these two places, and sort of the marine proximity to the ocean. We'd sort of have this types of information. That was technically true, and it was a way of connecting these two. And there are other people in the world in tasting notes that have also made these types of connections. So I wasn't being completely fraudulent. I was using information that someone else had proposed. Okay, and then the incentives. I might have told you that everyone coming into the lab got $25 to participate, and it took them about 50 minutes by the time they sat down and went through the auctions and left the room. $25. I think that's fair. Some of my colleagues are starting to pay more now, and now that's not going to be good because now I'm going to have to pay more to keep up with Harry. And we told the subjects, and this is pretty important, so we told the subjects before we got going that for every bottle of wine, all 7 bottles of wine up front, at the very end, one subject would be randomly drawn from a drum. So we had these 24 people in the room, and I had a big bowl of bingo balls at the front labeled 1 to 24, and at the end I draw a bingo ball, and that bingo ball person, we would look at just the administrators would look at their bid, and we'd also randomly draw a market price for that bottle of wine. And I also had a bag of chips, and all these chips had different prices for the wines. And so we draw a bingo ball, we draw a price. So now I have, Ian's bingo ball, and I have a price. And so we privately go over to Ian's station, and we compare his bid to the market price. And and here we go. And if Ian's bid was more than the market price, then Ian got the bottle of wine, but he paid the market price. And if Ian, sorry to pick on Ian, but if Ian's bid was less than the market price, there'd be no sale. And in both cases, Ian's bingo ball stays out of the drum for the next 6 draws. And it was a way to really try to give people, to set the incentive so that they would bid an amount that really did reflect the most that they'd be willing to pay. So they knew that that's the most they'd be willing to pay, and at the end, there's a chance that they might pay that or they might pay something less than that. There was a distribution of prices on these chips that ranged sort of between $5 and $15. I never told them that, but I'll tell you that now because it's all said and done. They just knew there was a bag of chips up there that had some distribution. I told them it was a distribution around the retail price for these wines. In truth, it was perhaps a little low, because I wanted some people to be, when you pulled a $5 chip, people were pretty excited because they got a good deal. Keeps them coming back. And that's how it was done. And this isn't novel. This is how a lot of these consumer experiments are done in labs. Most economic departments have one or two of these types of labs doing similar types of experiments, but not with wine and not with reputation spillovers that I'm aware of. So here's the data that came in. So we had an average willingness to pay across everybody, across all the wines, was $9.06. And there was and as you would guess, there was a distribution around this. Some people had higher bids overall. Some people had lower bids overall. There's a few people who come in and just bid, $2 on all the bottles of wine. Troublemakers. So I'll show you, we have a way of sort of filtering out those people. But there wasn't too many of those types. There was also people who had quite a wide distribution. Some of the wines, they had a much higher valuation than others. So some people, you can see over here that people aren't that familiar with Virginia wines. On a scale of 1 to 5, it was 1.71. And people weren't very familiar with Viognier. It had a 1.84 out of 5. And so when that wine came up on the auction block, even though it is quite a nice wine, if I have some in my office, if you're curious, we could. That one had a fairly low valuation overall, okay? The Virginia Viognier. And a lot of that, I think, was driven by this sort of familiarity score. So that 906, there was quite a distribution around that number. People on average were 42 years old, mostly females, married, children at home. There is a funny statistic about the willingness to pay when you have children at home. It goes up. It's positive. I have a couple of children at home, so I can appreciate that. And we did capture quite a few of the self-acclaimed wine consumers. So we had these people, 78% of them called themselves the primary wine shopper in their household. We also collect information about more information than what I'm showing here, but we can try to collect information about food preferences, food habits. Sometimes it's interesting information to tie back to think about the data. And this is the familiarity with the wines, the familiarity with the regions, and then this is their average wine spending habits. So 29% of them spend less than $10 on average when they go to the store. 60% of them are in the $10 to $15 range, and then 11% are above that $15. And you can see that the average price here was $9.06, and here they self-report 29% spend less. But again, that's a little bit skewed because this average there's a lot in that average, and that plays out in how they think about this. So the results, some preliminary results. We found that relative to Chardonnay, the Pinot Gris wines had about a 55-cent, a statistically significant premium of about 55 cents per bottle. And that's, that would be the Oregon and the Virginia bottle. This is the California and the Oregon Pinot Gris. And so it was the California that was higher than the Oregon, but when you pooled them together, it had a 55-cent premium. Wines from Oregon and Virginia had bids that were statistically significant and negative, about $1.05. Those wines generated a discount of about $1.05 relative to the wines from California. And that shouldn't come as any great surprise. And then these treatment effects that I went to great lengths to set up this experiment, think about these treatments, thinking that people would have... when I did this the first time, it was kind of sad, but there wasn't any information treatment effects. So that was, I went home and sort of commiserated, bottle of wine. But actually, then the next day I got up and I thought, that's not such a terrible finding, because it wasn't, the fact that overall we found that effect is kind of in line with what we were thinking, whether we knew it or not. But maybe once you pool Oregon, California, and Virginia together, you might not see this type. And in fact, it might be a confounding effect where it was positive for some and negative for other, and overall you don't see it. So then we went back and we thought more carefully about the wines from Oregon and Virginia. And when you separate those wines from Oregon and Virginia, because they had these bids that were $1.05 less than the ones from California, we found that the bids for those wines, when you separate them out, those bids actually did respond to the treatments. They didn't respond to the AVA treatment. So when you gave them information about Oregon, Virginia, and then you talked about the AVAs in those regions, because those regions aren't very well established, giving more information about the region didn't do anything to their bids. But when you told them about the AVAs and you told them about how those AVAs are similar to these AVAs in France, then you found a positive and a statistically significant effect on that treatment 3 for those wines. So that to me is that's reassuring. That's a good result to me. And then perhaps I think we found that was about a 60-cent premium for those wines. So sort of you have $1.05 less overall, and you can get 60 cents from that back by having this link to France among these 264. And then furthermore, we took the sample, the 264 people, and we split it in half according to your familiarity with wines. So this would be familiarity with either wine regions or wine varietals. And it didn't matter which way you split it on either of those parameters. But for the half of people that were more familiar with wine regions or more familiar with wine varietals, they also had a statistically significant and positive effect on treatment 3. So again, that linkage to Europe had a strong positive effect for wine aficionados, if you will, and it had a positive effect for those wines from Oregon and Virginia. Okay? And then it even had the strongest effect among the wine aficionados on their bids for those wines, which we think are the emerging wine regions. I think if you really enjoy wine, drink a lot of wine, you might not think Oregon is an emerging wine region, but I think to many of the people, and when you look at wine shops in Ithaca, there's not a lot of Oregon wine available. So I think it's fair to call these two the emerging regions relative to France and to California. And I always like to finish a talk with some implications. I think it's probably just my extension appointment hat going on. And what does this mean to real people? What does this mean to some of my colleagues involved in this project? And it seems that when you draw attention to AVAs for wines from emerging regions, it really it maybe isn't a good use of your time and money. If it's an emerging region, then the AVA is probably even more emerging, and sort of dwelling on that type of information doesn't seem to have an impact on, although that's the information you're allowed to put on the label, it doesn't seem to have an effect, doesn't seem to impact consumer valuation of those wines. And even amongst your wine aficionados that pick up the bottle and actually read the front and back labels, it still didn't have, when you talked about the Monticello AVA in Virginia, it just didn't seem to have, doesn't resonate with consumers the same way it does when that AVA is linked to another region in another part of the world, in our case, to these well-established regions in France. Okay, and that really did resonate with subjects. And so if there is some non-label way to do this, it seems to have more bang for your buck in a marketing strategy way. I think I've said this, but this is just sort of trying to recap the main punchline, that it's these emerging regions and it's these consumers that have some wine knowledge seem to respond most to this treatment 3. I think that's where I stopped. I have a big table of results that I stuck at the end because I didn't want to. Someone told me once that's not a nice thing to do. But so I have heaps of more results if you're curious. I'm hoping to write this up soon. I've always got good comments from horticulture faculty and food science faculty. So if there's any questions or suggestions, I'm happy to. And Franny told me that people would be excited if I could stop before 1:10. I guess that's a problem. But if you have any thoughts. Thank you. How about Chris?
Just a quick comment. The reason you didn't put New York in there is to eliminate bias by locals who might know some region in New York already. And
Yeah, that's a good point. I should have said something. Yeah, there's a home bias effect that sometimes can go on, and so here we are in the Finger Lakes, and I think at one point we thought we might have included it, and then in the end, it just would be hard, especially if you're trying to submit it to some journal and they see this home bias effect. I think we could have added it as, at one point we were thinking about adding a fourth region. It might have been Washington, it might have been New York, but in the end it was this trade-off of the home bias effect, and then we felt that 7 wines, for people who weren't great wine lovers, to ask them to submit bids for more than 7 wines might be some fatigue going on in the lab too. But that's a good question. It's mostly this home bias. I think the wine states in the United States, the top is California, the second is Washington, the third is Oregon, the fourth is New York, and the fifth is Virginia. And so we picked 1, 3, and 5 as a way to motivate these wines. And that ordering changes a bit year to year, but that's sort of the 10-year trend. Did Ian or Jenny? How about Ian?
So I think where you see a huge impact is if you sort of could go past region and put a buzzword like champagne or cognac or armagnac, or where you get into the names that are specifically linked with a region, but the name itself is really well known.
Right.
And I guess that's illegal now as well under the WTO rules, but.
Yeah, so those macro regions. It's careful. It's a very funny. It's illegal to put that on the labels or on your promotional material, but it's something that you're allowed to talk about in the tasting room. It's something you're allowed to put in your tasting notes. It's something you're allowed to name a festival after. So there's this second order of information and that's why it kind of ties itself nicely to this collective reputation so it's not necessarily something that a firm is promoting, but a group of firms at a festival or as part of promotion of their appellation and sort of tying that appellation to some other part of the world. But then you're right, there's this degree of famousness of regions in other parts of the world, and how do people respond to those different and we thought there might be something because we thought that Burgundy was more famous than Alsace, but we didn't find any statistically significant difference as to those 3 different regions in France that we tied them to. But you're right.
People are confused by the word Burgundy because California for years sold cheap wine that they called Burgundy, and it's then there's Pinot Noir within Burgundy, and I think most Americans kind of haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah. And then at one point we were worried if we just said this information without our pictures, would that influence? And so maybe it's one of these things where there's a visual plus some text, which we were able to include in this. But how about Jenny?
We saw that they averaged 4 meals out a week. Is that normal? Is that high? And if it's high, would that increase or inflate the price they'd be willing to pay because they're comparing it to restaurants?
Yeah, that's a good question. Did we put that in this list?
It was in the.
Yeah, it was in the summary. So I think in an earlier model we included that as an explanatory variable. And does the number of restaurants per week influence your valuation of these wines? Thinking that people who go out more would spend more on wines, and it wasn't in this table, which makes me think that it fell out and it wasn't important. So we asked them how many meals do you eat per week, and there was a drop-down menu of between 1 and 21, and I was surprised to see it 4, but I think if you eat out at school or at work 3 days a week, then there's where that number is coming from. It was a bit high though. To me, that seemed high. I don't eat out 4 times a week, so.
It's Burger King and McDonald's, right?
Yeah, and then there's a quality of eating out. We might have also asked them, what's your average spending on a bottle of wine? What's your average spending at the grocery store per week? What's your average we asked them, like a survey, there's also survey fatigue. I think on this one we asked them 35 questions, and we asked more specific things. In the end, we know we won't use all this information, but we collect it because we have them trapped in the lab. Yeah.
It seems to me actually the subjects actually participating in your test must be actually very knowledgeable about the wines. If a subject like me have no idea, so that the AVA or whatever is useless to me actually. So are there any, my question for you actually are those how you decide to recruit which subjects to participate?
Yeah, so that's a good question.
If
So
you recruited me actually, so those you fail actually.
well, the only way we would recruit you is if, well, you wouldn't be allowed because you're a faculty member.
Well, no, I just
I have like a
why I say
big
me
bouncer at the
actually
door.
is because I have no knowledge about it. So how you decide actually this guy is knowledgeable or this person is knowledgeable?
Okay, so that's a good question. So in the flyer, in the call for subjects, we were fairly specific, and we said we're looking for, we're running a wine experiment, and you have to have purchased and consumed white wine at least once in the last 2 months or something like that. So that was the criteria for signing up. It was hard for us to check that information at the door, but we also asked that question in the survey, and occasionally you get people that when they answer that question, the survey is 0, then we drop them from the regression. We drop that observation from our analysis. So we ask them, how many times a week do you drink? Or we ask them, how often do you drink wine? Once a day, once a week, once a month type of thing. And then we use that information. That also has an influence on willingness to pay. And in the regression, we can, holding everything else constant, including this, we can try to tease out these treatment effects. That is a good question. That's sort of problematic. And I should say, if I have 1 minute, Franny's standing
No, it's
up
just
beside
so we
me.
don't lose everybody in Geneva before they ask their questions.
Oh, okay. So I think to sort of address this, you'll see that in the bigger model, we have, every time I report results, I have something called the full sample, which is everybody who came in, all 264 people. And then we have this restricted sample where we drop out people who don't drink wine, had bids, average bids less than $3, sort of these troublemakers. They were less than 21 years old, but there weren't any of those in the room. But people who didn't, this is sort of a way of looking at the more focused group. So that's a good question.
So,
Is there anybody in Geneva who has a pressing question?
oh, here we go.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, as part of the study, you were interested at all in the evaluation of wines according to the varietal and familiarity with Chardonnay versus Pinot Gris versus Viognier?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have, that's something we're going to explore more, but we've started to tease out and found that the valuation of Pinot Gris was higher than Chardonnay. The value of Viognier was less, but not statistically significant, but it was less than Chardonnay. And so we're doing some of the things I've been talking about here, I've also been doing by varietal. And so this is typically how economists think about it. They have all of this data, and today I talked about sort of the big picture results. I talked about the results for specific types of people, more or less knowledge about wine or more or less familiar with wine. But that's a good sort of next step, is to think about, do these treatment effects differ based on varietals? And my guess is the general story will hold up, but that the general story will be stronger for Pinot Gris and not as strong for Viognier. But it's just trying to think about what story, how I want to slice and dice the data to prepare these titles, these tables, which way is most effective. But that's a very good question. And something we're thinking about. Sort of the beauty of having so many observations is we can split the sample in half according to these different parameters. How about behind Ian?
Is there any reason why you chose whites rather than reds? I mean, your initial example was a red.
Right.
Mason.
Right. Good point. So at one point we thought, well, we didn't want to mix whites and reds, and then we had to decide whites or reds. Originally, we thought we were going to have New York in the mix, and we thought that if New York was in the mix, it would probably be a Riesling that would be in the mix, and then they weren't, and then we just kind of got going with whites. There is, and I talked to Tony Wolfe about this last week, there is a thought that we would try to replicate this with red wines, which would be fun if we found a similar set of results, but yeah, I don't have a great answer why we started with whites. I think we just kind of got going, and then we had done all this research and found all of these wines and went with it. But would be curious. That's a good point. How about?
So you said that there wasn't much effect from the AVA designation. I'm curious how sort of you promote an emerging industry while trying to maintain this quality that's recognized from a particular area. You know, if you're getting wines from outside the Monticello region and a consumer sees that and says, oh, this is what Virginia wines taste like, it must all be garbage like this one. How do you maintain that quality perception without a real, designation?
Yeah, so I guess, I hope I understand your question correctly, but I think, so we're not advocating that you sort of abandon the promotion and the work that goes into developing an AVA, but in addition to that, I think we think that to sort of give a kickstart to an emerging AVA, to bring in this sort of outside information might, and maybe this helps answer your question, but we found that the value of the AVA actually was stronger than the link for the California wines. So it's not really part of this set of results, it's sort of a second level of results, but the value of the AVA was actually more important for California wine, for all three wines in California, than was the link to Burgundy, Alsace, or the Rhone Valley. So it's sort of thinking about, developed wine region versus emerging wine region.
The level of AVA that you're using for California would be generic, like Napa Valley, not Los Carneros, or how specific were you?
So I was fairly specific. And in fact, the bottle of wine, maybe I showed you Zaca Mesa, said the San Ynez Valley right on the bottle of wine. I encouraged them to read that, and then I showed them a blow up like this on their, and so I said this is the San Ynez Valley. I showed them where it was down near Santa Barbara, and I did the same thing for a Pinot Gris that came from Monterey, but it wasn't the Monterey AVA, it was from Santa Lucia Highlands, which is a fairly small, and then I did the same for the Russian River Valley, which again is a, some people I didn't use the word Sonoma. I was pretty careful. I always said the AVA, and then I said the city for which that AVA was close to. So I never actually ever said the word Sonoma or Napa in any treatment. That's a good question. Did you have a question over here? I saw some. Okay. How about Bill?
Who buys the most wine? Who's the main consumer? Is it male, female? Because you had 74% of your participants were female, and they bought 80% of the wine. How does that?
Yeah, so that was a bit surprising to me too. So in states where wine is available in supermarkets, females buy a lot more wine than males. But in the state of New York, men buy more wine than women. So I was a little surprised by that, but that might have been a response to my call. These people sitting in their office, they saw the call for this particular, and they said, do I qualify for this experiment? But that's not exactly an answer to your question, but it does. I found that, since Prohibition stopped in this country, all these states have these different laws about who can sell and buy and hours of distribution. All of your sort of wine demographic information, you have this national demographic, but then each state, it does change surprisingly. Consumption changes a lot by state, which maybe is surprising, but it changes quite a bit, and the people who buy wine surprisingly different across states. How about Chris?
You mentioned at the beginning that the French are becoming quite restrictive in what they allow to be put on labels of foreign wines. If we extrapolate New York State, okay, you can't put from Rhone Valley or from someplace in France.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So that's like a domestic reputation spillover. And I should back up and say that that European agreement actually has all major European countries has restrictions on the Mosel Valley from Germany and pages from Italy. It just happens to be that France has the most pages of restrictions. But that's a very good question, Chris, because there is a little bit of buzz in the Monticello AVA. They're calling themselves the Napa Valley of Virginia. And so you even see these little, is anyone from Virginia? And have you heard that expression?
Does it have anything to do with Donald Trump buying the water?
It could. But it's not done in a sort of a promotional effort. I just hear people using this sort of expression. The first time I heard it, I was thinking, that's a curious domestic reputation spillover.
But that wouldn't be legal on the label either, though.
But that wouldn't be legal on the label. But again, it's sort of these non-label references or non-label promotion efforts.
But seriously, this tiny little mail, who would like to read this? Just like credit card, this kind of stuff.
Oh, but all
If you buy a lot of wine, you definitely read the label.
and every year when you have a new label, you have to submit your proof to the TTB, and they have to approve your label. So it's very regulated. So, Franny?
Thank you very much. I thought it was really interesting. Good job.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.